This is Dr. Fox. Thank you all for your continued support for CRPN and CRPN Central. For more information about our mission, please contact us today at info@crpaynet.com for details.
Thank you for your interest in this clinical trial. Before we do anything, we need to go over an informed consent and ask you to sign and agree to participate in this study.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate being allowed into this clinical trial, and I hope it will help future generations. I do have some questions and concerns, though. Can you take some time to go over this with me? What is this informed consent all about, anyway?
Well, an informed consent is a document that we keep on file to show that we keep you, our trial participant, informed about the trial, its risk, and your willingness to voluntarily participate in this clinical trial. Trials are experimental by nature. We can't guarantee they will help our participants, and we want to make sure that you know about the risk of participating.
Okay, but what if I don't want to do this trial anymore? Am I locked into this agreement, like some kind of contract?
Oh goodness, no. As a volunteer, you can withdraw your consent and leave the study at any time, and your choice to stay in or leave the study will not change your access to normal health care. We do offer you a small inconvenience payment for your troubles, but we are not allowed to pay you so much that it could influence your decision to stay in the study.
This is a lot to think about. Do I have to make this decision today? I don't want to feel rushed. This is my health at risk.
Please take all the time that you need. You are in control, and we really appreciate your willingness to consider the trial. Take the consent home, read it, think about it, talk it over with your family, and let us know whenever you make a decision. We will be here whenever you are ready.
Informed consents, legal and regulatory documents that hold decades of industry history, years of responsibility, and a mandate for transparent communication to the most important stakeholder in our industry. Unfortunately, clinical research has forged a history of mistrust for many of our trial participants, and it will take years of accountability to change their minds. Sponsors, I know you are fighting tight timelines and limited budgets, but please look at the trial participants who are volunteering to put their lives on the line to advance your technology as far more than a cost and a liability. They are your greatest collaborator, and you should treat them with the utmost respect that is deserved. When you get to that level, you will enroll far more successfully in trials, save time and money, and foster a lasting relationship throughout our society. Sites. Informed consents are so much more than a formality, a checkbox, or a task to rush through. They are your commitment to the trial participants, and therefore the most important document that you will ever complete. Know your industry's history, know its regulations, and understand the importance of proper informed consent for a true industry of respect, transparency, and trust. Welcome to CRPN Central, the official podcast of the Clinical Research Payment Network. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Fox. CRPN Central discusses the real issues with our clinical research industry to explore and identify mutually beneficial solutions for all of our stakeholders. Informed consents are by far one of the most important processes that we perform as clinical research professionals. Our trial participants have these protected rights for many reasons, some of which are rooted into questionable and professional practices that have violated some of our most basic human rights and ethics. In a rapidly changing world of technology, efficiency, and complexity, how may we improve informed consent processes for compliant site and trial participant experiences? Today, we will discuss the most important document in our industry, informed consents, defined as the process in clinical research that helps potential participants make informed decisions about whether to take part in a study that includes full disclosure about the study, its purpose, risks, benefits, and study processes and procedures. First, we will discuss informed consents with an experienced trial participant and industry professional. Then, we will speak with an experienced regulatory professional about informed consent compliance and site processes. To maintain valid comparisons, both interviews will use the same questions, and my guests did not know the questions before the interview. We will reconvene after the interviews, compare answers, and perhaps discover how we as an industry may improve the informed consent process for our sites, our sponsors, and our trial participants. Our first guest has worked in large CROs for many years and has volunteered as a trial participant across numerous clinical trials. Erica Harris has worked as a clinical trial manager at a global CRO organization. She has represented leadership and administrative roles throughout the city of Detroit and has now founded her own consulting service where she offers critical guidance in success, motivation, and passion. Erica is a font of knowledge in and out of our industry, and I am so thankful she has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome with me Miss Erica Harris. Erica Harris, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for asking.
Thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today. Would you be willing to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I have recently transitioned out of my CTM role into a freelance consulting role as part of my advocacy endeavors. I am Erica, the energetic, respectful, inclusive, collaborative, and authentic advocate by your side.
Oh my gosh, that's probably one of the most inspirational and energetic intros I have ever seen in my life. You have experience being a trial participant?
Yes, I have done research studies in the past. I've done them in two capacities where I was actually consented and went through a research trial, but also standard of care. Recently with the pandemic, I have a perspective of it twofold.
Today's topic is informed consent, specifically that process that we do in clinical research where we sit down with a participant and we explain the clinical trial, what they're going to go through, their rights and their opportunities during the trial, their personal rights, and importantly, what's going to happen in the end. Almost like our arrangement, our agreement, our promise to the clinical trial participants who are risking so much to try to advance technology in medicine. I'm going to ask you a series of questions today, and I'm going to ask those questions to another individual, and we're going to compare your answers to the answers of that other individual, and we're going to see if maybe we can try to find some kind of an alignment between informed consents, how we do them, and maybe how we can make them a better experience for our trial participants, our sites, and importantly, our industry.
Okay.
Can you walk me through the informed consent process from your understanding from start to finish?
Okay. I'm interested in trial X for indication Y, and I have arrived at the site. The study coordinator greets me. She has the printed consent form for me to review. He or she goes over the basics of the study, risk, cost, voluntary participation, procedures, time commitment, and then I'm given time to go through the consent form myself, review for any questions. I would then initial every page of that consent form as well as sign and date it at the end, where in some cases the study coordinator would also sign off as a witness, and then the principal investigator would sign off that he or she has addressed any of my questions that I had at the time of that consent.
What happens before the informed consent process for a participant?
I think there are a few ways. For me as a patient, I know that there are advertisements that do introduce the study before the actual consent process. I saw a TV advertisement, an online advertisement. I visited clinicaltrials.gov and saw it. There are avenues where I was introduced to the study beforehand. The clinicaltrials.gov option, or when you're seeking out the options, that's typically because you're looking for a specific treatment, or you're looking for a specific compensation, or you're looking to visit a specific site. And then where you see the advertisements, it's just generally what's going on in healthcare right now that they're looking to get more data on. I've seen it both ways.
Somehow, some way, you're recruited into a trial, and then they ask you to sign an informed consent before they do anything. That's the number one rule. After you sign the informed consent, what do you feel like are the promises that are made to you as a trial participant?
I think the main promise of the informed consent is that there will be open communication about any changes to study X or indication Y. The number two promise is safety, that I have a person to contact if I have some undisclosed side effect or if I have some last minute questions and things like that.
Maybe even the promise of a voice sometimes. I know that when you sign the informed consent, one of the most important things from what we've seen in the history of clinical research, which is why informed consent is so very important, is that promise that this is completely voluntary and that you can leave at any time. You can withdraw your consent to make sure that you as a trial participant have a right to control your participation in this trial.
Yes, that piece has been a little bit turned down because, like you said, typically you communicate with the trial participants directly, like at your visits and things like that, or via wearable devices or whatever the mode of communication or data collection is. But as you mentioned, if I all of a sudden want to voluntarily withdraw, rarely do you see sites or staff reaching out to follow up on specific reasons of withdrawal or loss to follow up and things like that. Having a voice in it is really important. And that's why I was interested in doing this interview with you today, because I think sometimes we lose those reasonings behind patient-doctor relationships. The patient just became uncomfortable with the doctor, or the patient was uncomfortable with the feedback they were getting in the results, or things like that.
I have seen so many times patients being afraid to stop participating because they're afraid that they might be punished or they might lose services or care that they might need. That goes back to the whole, you can't really have undue influence on a trial participant.
Yes, you make a great point, because sometimes, patients are in the clinical trials for treatment. They really need this treatment. This is the only option they have. Their health insurance doesn't cover it, or they don't have access to the care that's needed. Or you have participants that's just doing the research for monetary compensation, and after they've got their rent payment, they're like, okay, I'm done with that, and things like that.
That's really, really important, especially when it comes to informed consent, to understand the reason why we're doing it in the first place. You've been in the industry, you've taken GCP, maybe even city training. Do you know the history of informed consent and why it is developed in a way that it is?
I think my general basic knowledge is I have two examples: the Tuskegee Airmen, where they did an experiment without consent, or Henrietta Lacks, where they used samples without consent. Basically just consenting to the right to our bodies, the right to our freedom.
Tuskegee definitely comes to mind. Nuremberg Code, Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, all of these things that we have studied in history that are travesties and reasoning for trying to ensure proper informed consent. I want to make sure that we as an industry do not forget why the informed consent is so important based off of the history of what we as human beings have literally done to each other intentionally.
As I was mentioning about my answer to have I signed a consent form myself as a participant, I have. And those where I actually went to a site, I found that study myself. I was introduced to it voluntarily. Whereas in the pandemic, I feel like getting those vaccinations, it wasn't so voluntary, and I didn't actually see a consent form, and I didn't actually see any follow-up data. It's just I agreed to do it because that's what the media was telling us to do. And now I tell my doctor, here's my lot numbers, here's the vaccine I got. I guess check me for anything that's going on. But being in the industry and seeing the results yourself, you want to know specific feedback. Do I now have a cancer risk? Do I now have a visual impairment risk? Things that I've seen from some other vaccine studies. You make a great point in differentiating research from standard of care.
Clinical research as a care option has always been kind of a thorn in my ear because back in the day when they did Tuskegee, that was a care option. But in the background, they were actually doing a clinical trial. I don't feel like we should really be calling clinical research that, based off of not only the history, but also the true intentions of clinical research. Now, there may be benefits and really positive consequences to research for our trial participants, but that is not the primary objective. And I think that the informed consent process also spells that out. There are risks. We can't guarantee this is going to be a care. We can't guarantee that this will make you better. You understand that, and you're signing this saying that you understand that.
I agree with that. They can't define all the the risk up front. But that's the importance of collecting that patient engagement feedback and that follow-up information to ensure that the data that we do have consent to use or collect is being leveraged in the potential risks that could brew for other patients or participants. People do standard of care, agree to things, and versus actually signing a consent form, I get your message in it that without people going to the doctor and saying, sure, you can take a biopsy of my skin because you've never seen it before, and they're doing that standard of care, just say at a dermatology appointment, and then 2 years later, now all of a sudden they're doing a research study on it to say, let's see where this is happening in other patients.
You got to be real careful with the rights of a trial participant and what they're agreeing to, what you're promising to doing, and then what you're going to do with that information. I cannot stress how very important the informed consent is. People just write it off as, oh, this is the very beginning. We got to check off a box. We got to do this. But if you really look at the relationship that you are making with that trial participant, every time you go through an informed consent, it is far more important than the value that I think that we as an industry put on it every single day.
I agree. The confidentiality piece of it is a big piece for me because for that biopsy example, if I agree with my primary care physician to take a biopsy to give me some feedback on my condition, I would presume that he or she would inform me that these were the results that they found and this is what they plan to do with it. For my knowledge and my care, where and in the Henrietta Lex case, where years later now family is getting compensation for discoveries and creations from that biopsy, where that doctor didn't disclose that those were potential outcomes of that biopsy.
What are some of the challenges that we face right now during our current and even some of the future informed consent processes that we have?
The top challenge that we have right now is clear communication. And I say that because a lot of patients are in a hurry. Everything is about time and they're just rushing through it. Sure, I'll do it because the monetary piece of it, or they just want to get the treatment and see if it's going to help them. And I do think that there are some ways to streamline that in the way that we currently do medicine with EMR and virtual visits and things like that.
Let's talk about content and challenges because, oh my gosh, it goes back to the whole communication and time. Hurry up and sign this. We got to get on to the trial. By the way, it would take you an entire month to read this because lawyers wrote it to protect the sponsors, and then it was approved by an IRB, so that it was supposedly at the language of what's at the max an 8th grade reading level. But at the same time, really look into there on content. From a site perspective, the two largest components of the informed consent process that are really sticky for sites is definitely injury and damages. The other one is, of course, the compensation, the stipends themselves. There are all of these different challenges that we have with time, communication, and content in this informed consent.
Yes, you make a great point around content. My biggest takeaway there regarding risk management, the patient is solely responsible for knowing the proper avenues. And in the consent form, in case of an emergency, contact your primary care physician. That stands out to me because as you indicated, typically when you go to the doctor, they ask you what kind of insurance you carry. And then as you're going through intake, then they ask, have you done any research studies? What medications are you on? And then they get that information. So we're aligning risk and liability in very different ways here. But one big takeaway is, especially in clinical research or pharmaceutical research or device research, is actually the manufacturing piece of it, because I find that sometimes drug stability or drug effectiveness or things like that can really be affected based on those pieces, which typically don't go into the consent form. They do tell you what dose you're getting and things like that, but they don't tell you who manufactured that drug and who you can contact in case your doctor says no or your insurance says no. It would be now, well, that drug was manufactured somewhere.
That's a very good point that I had never considered, but there are parts of the clinical trial process that you would think trial participants should be informed about. Where are their labs being shipped? Where are their samples going? What is the chain of custody? Who is responsible for all of these different components of their data?
Yeah, let's just say it's an HIV trial, for instance, and you're giving samples on a regular basis, but those samples are only shipped out once a week, which changes sample stability, assuming, considering lab practices, and then that sample gets somewhere, and depending on their practices, now it changes stability even more, and then you get a result that you're up in arms about. Well, my levels were just low before, now they're through the roof.
There's a level of transparency that is not present in our current informed consent processes. In the days of tokenization, this is a big problem right now in informed consent. Tokenization, the process of taking patient data and tokenizing it. In other words, trying to encrypt it to a point where you cannot identify that patient, and then trying to use that for more than one trial. It's kind of like you gain some information and you can use that one trial participant for multiple trials off of a single informed consent. It is becoming a major concern across the industry, especially sites. And it's not because sites feel like they're going to be running out of a job because they're being more efficient with patient data. It's far more because that patient may or may not choose to consent to all of these different trials that their tokenized data is being a part of. And on top of that, when you become tokenized, it's far more difficult to withdraw consent because you are now tokenized. So the only way to withdraw consent is to unencrypt and re-identify your data, which is the whole purpose of tokenization.
Yes, most of the time our samples are de-identified to maintain confidentiality. But then when there's a medical issue or things like that nature, it brings about the need to re-identify that patient, or if there's a death.
What do you think are the benefits of the current and future informed consent processes?
Data transparency, health trends, oversight. Those are maybe the top three that I could think. If you sign in a consent form, then you're comfortable as a patient to say someone's overseeing your health. So I think there are still benefits of consent for sure, but I think it's just based on accessibility, really, for the people that don't really know where to get the in-depth information or don't know how to think about it on an aerial view, and they just want someone to kind of handhold them through their health condition.
It's kind of like that outreach to the trial participant to assure them that what they are going through is controlled, and honestly that in a way they are in control of the situation. You had said that you have signed an informed consent before, right?
I have.
How did you feel after signing that and even throughout the process of a clinical trial?
I've always felt supported in the consent process per se. I think it can vary based on the person's competence, which I think is a big piece of consent laws is, the patient's competence to even do a trial.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Having to work with ASENT or legally authorized representatives or LARs is a totally different level of hoops that you'd have to go through to try to get through those participants who may not be able to cognitively understand the full consent process.
And it shifts the risk as well, because if you have a LAR or you have a parent signing off, you would have to question the viability of that study for that particular patient, because now the LAR has decided what was best for that patient or the parent has decided what was best.
How may we improve the informed consent process for compliant site and trial participant experiences?
I think to allow the patient to actually ask the questions that they're interested in knowing. If I'm sitting in my doctor's office right now and he's like, I have this study, are you interested in it? Instead of going through the whole consent piece, what the patient is actually concerned with would be more of an issue than what's in the consent form, because how many of us actually keep the consent form? I think I have some consent forms in there I signed from years and years ago, but standardly, how many people actually hold on to their consent forms to be able to go back legally and say, oh yeah, I remember I was in this research study and maybe, my blood clotting issue stemmed from this.
There's a big push right now, a number of people who are advocating to really allow the trial participant to be a part of the clinical trial development process. Before a trial trial is a thing, while they're creating the informed consent process, some people are saying maybe we ought to start bringing patients into the mix while we're writing the informed consent, while we're actually developing the protocol so that they can have more of a voice in the process. How do you feel about including the patient way upstream while we're developing?
I think focus groups are a great way. Actually, I think it's a mode of data collection as well, because if you're at your local doctor's office and you have a focus group of patients to ask them what their health concerns are, that data alone will help doctors determine what studies they need or what community concerns are.
If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I said, what would you like to tell the entire audience about informed consents, where we are now, and where you would like to see them go, what would you tell them?
I would like the informed consent process and the healthcare process to be an inclusive and engaging process. That means having the patient's experience, the doctor's experience, the vendor's experience, having an all-in-one experience in that protocol or in that consent form streamlines the data effectiveness and efficiency as well as the study outcomes.
Be inclusive, be engaging, listen to our patients, let them have a voice, and really be empathetic to their voice and take it under consideration. And if we can do that, then we can truly bring them into the loop, make them part of the process, and let them know how much we appreciate what they have done, not only through the informed consent process and the promises that we keep to them, but also for the generations of participants and patients who might benefit from what they are doing right now.
Yes, that was a great summary or paraphrase of my share.
Erica, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. It was an absolute pleasure. I look forward to seeing you at the live event.
Thank you.
All right, bye. Our next guest has served our country and our industry's regulatory front lines for years. Kelvin Peak is an experienced combatant medic for the U.S. Army and a regulatory compliance professional who has worked at site-level university and industry regulatory and program administration. Now, as a consultant, Kelvin ensures his clients have the best in regulatory compliance guidance and services. Kelvin is an amazing and knowledgeable professional in our industry, and I am so thankful he has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome with me Mr. Kelvin Peak. Mr. Kelvin Peak, the man, the legend. Thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today.
Oh, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
For those of us who don't know Kelvin, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Kelvin Peak. My story getting into clinical research is very similar to everyone else's. I kind of got into it by accident when I was working as a college health administrator, outreach programs and things with like drug addiction. So one of the contractors, they came to one of my booths when I was doing a topic related to contraceptives. A recruiter approached me saying that, hey, we think you might be interested in a regulatory coordinator position. So I'm like, what is that exactly? So she set up the interview with the hiring manager and said, I would think you may be a good fit. You have a degree in chemistry, you have a good background in the U.S. Army as a combat medic. I think you can handle it. And then after I have a conversation with them, they say, hey, you got the job. Because of COVID, things didn't really work out. I needed to take a break from clinical research in general. I kind of got burnt out. I took the steps I need to prioritize self-care. The thing I wanted to work on more was something in leadership. I was pretty good at the clinical because of my previous experience in the U.S. Army, but I didn't really have the business acumen or the standard project management skill set in order to be a reliable regulatory coordinator at that time. So after I took a break, I went to graduate school for a master's in health administration. After that, I got a call from another recruiter saying Dartmouth is interested in you. They have a study start position open. Before that, the regular position I had was just regulatory maintenance. Regulatory maintenance is kind of like the execution side of project management, but I haven't done the study startup part, which is more of kind of a hybrid between project management, business development. You do more interactions with regulatory bodies to develop consent forms and things like that. That's kind of where I got more interested in the ethics part of clinical research and in terms of how to be an advocate for patients through excellent consent form writing, what the respect for persons ethical principle means from the Belmont report, how to really gauge what you're writing if you're writing for your patient.
Kelvin, what a professional. I think I picked the exact person to talk about this topic. Today's topic is informed consent.
Oh, excellent.
Defined as that process, that document that we hold sacred in this industry to provide to our patients, to maintain, to make sure that it's explained to them, to make sure that we document that it's explained to them, and to make sure that at the end, our patients have protected rights as participants in clinical research. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I've asked these questions to another individual already. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare your answers to these questions to the answers of that other individual. And then we're going to come back and we may have a live event. We're going to compare your answers. We're going to see if we can't identify things that align so we can maybe figure out ways to have a better informed consent process across the industry.
Excellent. Let's do this.
As that regulatory expert, as that startup expert who has been working on informed consents, writing informed consents, doing everything about them, could you walk me through your perception of the informed consent process from start to finish?
From start, when you're awarded a study and you have the CA approve and feasibility is all good to go, then you have a regulatory packet, and one of the documents you have is the informed consent document. You get the sponsor's copy, which is approved either through their commercial IRB. Even though it's approved for the commercial IRB, it is not written in the language that's appropriate for patients at all. A lot of times the language and not only the length of the form itself, but it's not talking to the patient. It's not saying that we want you to understand what these concepts are before we can get into it. What I usually have to do is I have to go through line to line and I have to edit it to conform to the basic elements from CTEP. CTEP is the NIH regulatory body who creates different informed consent form artifacts for you to follow. It tells you what you need to key information section. You need to have things like the introduction, make sure you have the FDA statement saying that this is an investigational product being used, make sure you have a statement saying this is a voluntary study, tell them what the indication is. I would take the sponsor's draft document and I will compare it to CTEP standards for measuring whether it's readable and acceptable for patients. I would almost rewrite the entire consent form, I will say that, from the sponsor. Sometimes I would just go to the protocol and just rewrite it from there because it's not an acceptable format for patients at all. And if you go to the CTEP's website, it gives you the template what to follow and give you all the guidelines for correct readability. One of the sections that really irks me is the treatment section, where they just repeat the same thing over and over again. It's overburdensome for patients. Instead of using that whole blog that's close to 60 pages, I would condense it into a table, and then I'll give a general description of what the services are, and then talk about critical steps in the treatment phase. If you have this long blog of text that's close to 60 pages, I don't think that's acceptable for anyone. Another area is the cost language tool too. It's really hard to sometimes write down what the patient's responsible for in terms of billing. A lot of times when you do your Medicare coverage analysis, our finance team will give us the heads up about what we can put in the consent form based on the MCA. It can lead to a lot of conflict if they don't negotiate things correctly with the sponsor about what should be billable and what should not be billable.
What about stipend? Do you ever run into that and conflict between what's negotiated versus what gets put into the ICF?
All the time. And usually the issue is with, are we going to use a local vendor or we can use a third-party vendor? Depending on the site's policy, some may allow that, some may not allow that. If they don't allow it because there have been some privacy and security issues sometime in the past, and sometimes in the contract, the indemnification language doesn't attribute risk. If something happens where you have a breach, the vendor would not take responsibility for that risk if a breach should happen. And so that causes an issue with using the sponsor's preferred vendor.
It sounds like you receive a regulatory packet after you're awarded a trial. You have to take that informed consent draft that's sent to you in your regulatory packet, and you have to apply it by your industry standards and the standards of other entities like NIH. And then after chewing it up and converting it into a model that is applicable to your organization, I assume you send it to the IRB for review?
No, I send it to the sponsor or its delegate, which is the CRA usually. We could negotiate the ICF language, have an all red line about why I made certain revisions and why by our standards we felt as though that when we revise it, is acceptable for a patient to consume.
What if I told you right now that there's a sponsor that's sending out a letter to every site and they're saying, by the way, we've decided we're just going to do a trial-wide informed consent.
Oh, goodness.
You're not allowed to change it. You have to just accept it because our internal ethics committee approved it.
Oh, how I feel about that? It's going to be a no-go. Usually we have SOPs in place that we send them saying that this is what we're going to use, this is what we agreed on. We're going to apply IRB standards to redraft this consent form because locally this is what makes sense for outpatient population. Maybe they'll be good for a smaller site or something that's more commercial, but if you're working at an institution with already established SOPs, that's not going to happen.
Let's say you go back and forth, you've modified it, you've negotiated the informed consent language, you have an approved IRB informed consent. What happens after that?
If it's approved as study startup, we usually send it back to the sponsor and they just check it off and say, hey, great job. When we have a protocol amendment, we review it and then we send it to the DSMB and we send it to our team and then I submit it to our local IRB for review to ensure that these revisions or they did have IRB board approval before we can implement the changes to both the ICF and the protocol. In the IRB, they may have some concerns with the consent form language. If they do have concerns with the language, they'll tell me what those concerns are, and I just kind of liaison between the IRB and tell the sponsor CRA that we need to have this changed because it doesn't align with our ethical standards.
Whenever there is an official IRB approved protocol, as I recall, that means that nothing is allowed to be performed on that trial participant until that trial participant signs the new informed consent form.
So that one's a little bit tricky because it's still in the process of being IRB review because sometimes you have to look at the schedule of events when the patient is coming in. Let's say that we submit it to IRB and it's not approved yet. We would still have to do everything from the protocol that's currently approved, and then we would have to schedule a reconsent a little bit later. What CRCs or whoever's in charge of the consent form process at ClinOps level, they would generally do a phone call and they may set up maybe a remote consent session with the patient saying that I want you to be aware of these new risks because it may impact your willingness to further participate in this trial.
From my experience, one of the number one reasons for a deviation is the utilization of that IRB approved date on that informed consent form and when something is performed on the patient. If they have reconsented, if they signed the wrong consent form, there's this huge confusion around a participant's signature on an ICF and the performance of the trial. Do you ever run into that?
Yeah, I've run into a lot of different ways. Maybe someone gets really busy, something gets approved, and it's still not IRB approval. And what happens when there's this queue and no one's like processing the approved forms, then people are still using the previous one and it causes issues with reconsent. They say, hey, we saw that subject 005 came in on Thursday. However, this consent form was approved on Monday. What's happening here in terms of administration? I won't say it's a human error specifically. I will say always look at it from a system issue. What happened in the system that caused that person to not see that this new consent form was approved, and then drill down to maybe with policy, or do they have a high workload? You have to do due diligence, do a root cause analysis, looking at it from three different pillars and not just default to human error when you see something like that.
That's one of the biggest reasons for a CAPA at a site.
It is.
What are some of the other challenges that we face during current and future informed consent processes?
Training. That's probably the number one, in my opinion, is protocol training and training how to properly obtain consent. When I say protocol training, is really understanding what are the processes you need to do in order to carry out the informed consent process. Sometimes someone may be so-called experienced, but when they go migrate to another site, they're not doing things by that site SOPs. So they need to follow those SOPs to ensure that they're actually obtaining consent the proper way. Another big issue is not having proper documentation of consent. After the CRC or research nurse, they do everything great. They have a teachable moment to ensure that the patient understands the consent form. Everything is perfect. But then you're still missing documentation that you actually had that conversation. What was the patient's impressions when you had the conversation? Can you confidently say that the patient voluntarily joined the study? Maybe know the patient's body language, because sometimes the body language and nonverbal cues can give you indication whether there's concern about participating. Those are things you need to put in the documentation consent. You're just annotating that the patient understood what was going on, talked about very specific things in the trial. They understood what their responsibility was from the scheduled events.
The SOPs that I've seen at sites for informed consent have very, very similar standards. Number one, first and foremost, and this is actually really hard to do, is you really need to perform informed consent in a private and quiet place.
Amen.
That's really, really hard to do in a clinic. Number two, you have to make sure that the patients have access to the informed consent and everything. Number three, you have to make sure that the patients have adequate time to review the material.
Absolutely.
Take it home and think about it. Number four, do you have any questions? If you have any questions at all, call me at any time. And finally, number five, you have to make sure that you can ensure that the patients have a signed copy, either electronically or physically, of the informed consent after you go.
Those are very common ones.
What do you think are some of the benefits that we have right now to informed consent?
We have very passionate CRCs and people in clinical research. The senior staff members, they know what they're doing. Some local RBs have a compliance office for both training, education, and process improvement. They do internal reviews. That was one of my last jobs. I was like a compliance person for the informed consent process. For what is happening right now and for the future, I think the future really is going to be e-consent. And it's not what you think. I think people confuse e-consent with remote consenting a lot. You can do e-consent both in person and remotely. E-consent is actually a very integrated approach to being more interactive, explaining what the trial details are with the patient. It doesn't take away the investigator's responsibility for what the overall output is. Whatever process you do, it doesn't matter if the patient is reading videos, as long as you have a collection of processes that leads to an agreement to take part in the trial. What is e-consent? It's using multimedia, it's using different virtual apps, blended learning opportunities, and courses, everything to make sure that your patient understands what the trial is all about, and you're providing every tool to make sure they understand what it is. You have ways for transparency, you have ways to communicate to your CRC if you don't understand anything, and I've actually read something about more conversational AIs being implemented, especially for the aging population, because they're more about talking to someone in order to understand what they're getting into.
We're talking about 21 CFRs. You've literally taken entire positions dedicated to informed consent. It is a really big deal. And I think that we can both agree that there are entire arms of regulatory around informed consent. What's the big deal? Why is informed consent so important in clinical research?
Well, we can go back to the Tuskegee incident, the Tuskegee syphilis trials, where it was just horrible what happened to the black participants who were deceived by the researchers about what they were getting into. They weren't there treating them at all. They were to observe syphilis disease in black males. This is what causes a lack of trust in clinical research. It created a legislature and improvements to ethical standards about what respect for persons truly means in clinical research and how to really rebuild trust. And that's when they came up with these three pillars. The first was autonomy. The way you ensure autonomy is to create processes where if you notice that a patient has diminished mental capacity to make a decision, you create whatever tool that they need to understand the trial and to make a informed decision to take part in research. The second pillar is information. They have everything they need. You're being really transparent and saying this is what everything is. These are all the risks. These are all the benefits. This is all the cause. This is what we're going to do. This is what your treatment is. This is what the cause is. The last one is voluntarism. And that's where the documentation of the informed consent process comes in handy. So you have a statement saying, okay, you can withdraw from the trial anytime you want to. Do you understand that? Please stop me anytime if something doesn't make any sense. And you want to repeat a few times that it is your voluntary decision and your decision alone to take part in this research or not. If you don't want to take part, that's okay with us too.
Another part of the voluntarism is definitely undue coercion.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So you have to be very aware that when you're a physician, that your position sometimes can cause undue influence for getting a participant in the trial because you're in a perceived level of power or authority. It's your job as a physician or provider to level your position. You're in service of the patient, not the other way around.
It's not like we can pay the patients or bribe them to stay in the study.
Oh, goodness.
We're not allowed to give them a huge stipend to stick around because it has to be fully voluntary. It's not like they can say, I depend on being in this trial because it's my job because I get money. We can't do that. How may we improve the informed consent process for compliant site and trial participation experiences?
Just having good SOPs. Everything, in my opinion, starts at the process level. If you have good processes, you have compliance. And a lot of times, it's easier said than done, but you have to do testing. If you're going to develop an SOP, you want to ensure that it's reproducible. So you go back and you talk to your subject matter experts and say, what do you guys think about this change? And they go back and do that process from step 1 to 7 or whatever and see if it's reproducible, and they give feedback about how to improve it. That is one great way to improve the overall consent form process, because you're ensuring that your process is working and that anyone can do it, but involving the people who own the floor to get it done. I've seen many times where there's changes in SOP, and I have no idea that this change was going on without any of our input at all. That's problematic when leaders do that. You can't just implement processes without getting input from your subject matter experts, and I think that's what's causing a lot of errors, is sometimes leaders should make these changes without the proper input.
So essentially, we try to go through and make processes, but we don't apply the correct stress tests or beta tests upon them before we start to implement them.
Absolutely. Whatever test you want to do.
So in other words, haste makes waste.
Yep.
We don't talk with each other. We don't have the right stakeholders in place that are actually going to be using the systems, and as a result, we fail.
Exactly. It all starts at the process level, but you have to have the correct inputs in order for it to be successful.
Now we're going to go back to DMAIC for any of our Six Sigma friends out there.
Absolutely.
If I were to give you the microphone right now and I said, Kelvin, what would you like to tell the audience about informed consent, where we are now, where we want to be, and how we can make it better? What would you tell them?
Our current state is improving. We have passionate and very experienced coordinators and regulatory analysts and CTMs and CRAs who knows how to do this process correctly. For the future state, I think e-consent is the way, mainly because we're having these new privacy laws coming in. You probably go on your website and you see these cookie warnings saying, do you want to opt in or opt out or not? And I think that's really prepping us, because if you have it just in a paper version, then you're going to have to find some kind of way of tracking the opt-in, opt-outs for the paper version. And I think e-consent has better mechanisms for tracking opt-in, opt-out for data security. E-consent doesn't replace the consent form process at all, or the investigator's responsibility to carry out how to ensure that the patient understands the trial, and also it doesn't take away your processes of measuring voluntarism, whether they understand all the information, and whether you respect them as an autonomous agent.
Hold on to our passion for our patients and for doing the right thing. Develop amazing processes that it's very well informed and communicated with everyone. And importantly, start to embrace technology and get ready for some amazing innovations in the informed consent process for some very good research to come.
That's a good summary. I would say that bad technology is worse than no technology. Trust me.
Ooh.
You want to embrace for the future, but choose your vendor wisely. But always start at the process first, so you can understand which vendor is going to align with what your processes are in order to carry out the consent form process.
Kelvin, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. It's a pleasure to see you on stage and off stage.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you at the live event, and we'll talk to you very soon.
All right, take care.
All right, bye.
Erica has worked in the industry for years as a clinical trial manager, and now she freelance consults to continue her advocating journey. She has experience not only in clinical research trials, but also in standard of care research, giving her a twofold experience perspective. Trial participants sign informed consents to access Trial X for indication Y, and the promises of open communications for protocol changes, the confidentiality of our samples and data, and the safety disclosures are critical components to consider. Patients may be afraid of losing care, money, or opportunity, and therefore may be afraid to leave a trial. And it is critical to remember the why of informed consent as we remember the stories of the Tuskegee Airmen and Henrietta Lacks. Clear communication, including drug manufacturing and sample logistics, and proper risk management are considerable challenges for our trial participants when we lose our reasoning and value of patient-doctor relationships. And to improve the informed consent
consent process, and if we rely on our patient focus groups, ask the questions that interest our participants, and bring patient opinions at the forefront during the inception of a trial protocol, we may promote an inclusive, engaging, and empathetic experience in the informed consent process. Kelvin has worked in leadership roles from combat medic and admin to regulatory coordinator and regulatory startup manager for years. The informed consents provided by sponsors do not meet CTEP or ethical standards of many sites, and they require substantial revisions to meet organizational guidelines. While the protocol and informed consent processes are some of the greatest challenges we face, in the event an ICF is not processed correctly by staff, we should focus far more on improved processes and systems, not on human errors as a scapegoat. Our industry hosts passionate and dedicated professionals who care deeply about trial participant rights, and in addition to respecting autonomy, information, and voluntarism as the three primary pillars of informed consent, we must work diligently to document proper delivery and nonverbal cues of our trial participants. And while we've learned the importance of informed consents with the Tuskegee syphilis trials, and e-consent, not remote consent, holds a promise for the future, good SOPs and processes developed with proper stakeholder input are the cornerstone of proper and compliant informed consent execution. Both of today's guests recognize the importance of informed consent from our industry's past, with a specific reference to Tuskegee, and both also referenced improvements in inclusive engagement. And while Erica recommends interactive inclusion of trial participants and their questions in the processes and development of our trials, Kelvin focuses on the development of strong processes and quality trial performance. So, how may we improve the informed consent process for compliant site and trial participant experiences? Erica's participant experiences and Kelvin's focus on processes align into three distinct principles. To improve the informed consent process, we must focus closely on transparency, communication, and trust. Provide our sites and our trial participants with all of the information that they need to communicate expectations and make informed decisions. Establish the communication plans that we need and provide the time necessary to ensure comprehensive informed consent documents. And as a result, even with painful past actions, rebuild the trusting relationship that we as an industry need and work as a community toward better trial participant experiences for trials and years to come. Thank you for tuning in to today's impactful Informed Consent episode. Informed consent may be a daily practice for this industry. However, we cannot lose sight of its importance. Treat informed consent and our trial participants with the respect that they deserve. And if you are a trial participant, know your rights and do not be afraid to ask questions, speak your voice, and importantly, withdraw from a trial if you feel that it is not right for you. The choice is completely yours. Thank you to Erica and Kelvin for sharing their experiences with us today. Thank you, Michell and Brian Gattshall, for volunteering in today's CRP in Short. Finally, thank you to my CRP sponsors for making this podcast possible. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CRP in Central.